Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 9. Oh, I need to put my face somewhere here. Right next to the Soviet flag. How about? Okay, so for this week, I'm hoping to examine the Second World War as it relates to global political, economic, and social changes after the war. I also want to complicate the story of the war by ever so slightly deconstructing the goodness of the good guys and even the badness of the bad guys. But to start out, I should explain that I've got some very different styles of readings for this week. So, my first reading that I'm giving you is written by Edvard Kotzbeck, and it is a translation. I actually did the translation. This hasn't been published in English yet, but it's of a short story that he wrote in 1949 that ended up getting him sent to prison by 1952. So, Edvard Kotzbeck, just to give you a little bit of background, he was a member of the Politburo, so the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia. So he was one of the most important people in Yugoslavia politically. And during World War II, he had been part of a battalion called the Gupcheva Brigade that fought some really miserable conflicts against both the Italians and the Germans inside of Yugoslavia, Slovenia in the north. And at the end of the war, his unit was involved in some horrific murders of those suspected of collaborating with the Nazis and Italians. In June of 1945, roughly 100,000 Yugoslavs were murdered by Yugoslav communist partisans on the suspicion of having supported the Axis powers. And his unit was in charge of that. He felt tremendously guilty about it. And so he wrote this short story in 1949. And this short story so offended the censors in Yugoslavia that he not only lost the right to ever publish in Yugoslavia again, but he was sent to prison for 7 years. So I want you to kind of read between the lines. It's a fictional story, but it absolutely is drawn from his real wartime experience. And then the second thing I've got is just a short little 5-minute video about a resistor, someone who helped to resist the Holocaust. He's an American who was stationed in Paris, and the way he resisted is something that I hope you will find inspiring. So we're also dealing with the Holocaust this week, so a lot to deal with. So let's move on and start with Finland. So I want to start with the Finnish war experience because it doesn't really fit in any of our major narratives of World War II. So shortly after the Soviets moved in to take over the eastern half of Poland, which was part of the secret Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact to divide the country and agree to non-aggression against each other, the Soviets tried to conquer the Finns. Finland had been part of the previous Russian Empire, and the Soviets wagered that the other allies were too busy with Hitler to care. So the Finns resisted, and the Soviets proved particularly poor at fighting a winter campaign in the Finnish forests. Soviet weakness has often been explained as a consequence of Stalin's purges of the officer corps of the military, just also between 1937 and 1939. So, regardless, in 1939 and 1940, the Finns fought hard, coming up with innovations like the Molotov cocktail that comes from this conflict, which was named for the Soviet foreign minister, which they would throw at tank treads. Molotov cocktail, if you don't know, it's a small bit of gasoline in an old beer bottle, usually, with a sort of a something to act as a fuse on the top, usually like a flaming rag. And, if you just leave it, it acts as a candle, but if you throw it, the vaporized gasoline explodes. So they would throw these at tank treads, which would be enough to derail a tank, and then they would just wait for people to hop out of the tanks and shoot them. So they took out thousands this way. Um, so the Finns had little beyond some volunteer support from other mostly Scandinavian countries. By March 1940, they signed a peace treaty with the exhausted Soviets, allowing the Soviets to annex parts of Karelia and the far north of Finland. The Soviets in 1940 then annexed Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania shortly thereafter, using ruses like first establishing military bases and supporting domestic communist parties. Um, like in Poland, people in each of these countries had successfully resisted the Soviets during their own civil war. But through these ruses, they took over the three Baltic countries. So here's where Finland gets even more complicated, though. Many of the volunteers who fought against the Soviets were Nazi sympathizers. So in 1941, the Germans then used Finland to open up a front to take out Leningrad. This is after, uh, the non-aggression pact is over and Germany invades the Soviet Union. Uh, and Finns found themselves fighting what they called the continuation war against the USSR. So once they began to resist the Germans, Finn found themselves eventually at war with the Germans, Soviets, and even the British. So again, who were the good guys? Who were the bad guys here? Okay, let's. So outside of Finland, there was very little fighting in 1939 once the Poles surrendered. For the next few months, World War II was called by comics in the British press the Phony War. In April, things began to heat up again as the Germans took over Norway, then Denmark, the Netherlands, and Belgium, and then began their assault on France. In May, the entire British Expeditionary Force retreated from Dunkirk, and a few weeks later, the French surrendered. So one of the reasons that the oh, here we go. One of the reasons that the French surrendered relatively quickly was that many conservatives didn't want a repeat of the destruction of World War I. Marshal Pétain, the supreme commander of French forces from World War I, worked out a deal to govern the conservative south of France and French colonies as part of Vichy France, based in Vichy. It's a city in southern France. Well, the north and the entire coast, including Paris, would be governed by the Germans. France was divided almost along the same fault lines as had been seen 70 years earlier during the Franco-Prussian War, when large numbers of French people collaborated with the Germans to take out Paris. So, in both the occupied and free zones, many French people actively collaborating, helping to administer law and order for the occupiers, participating in the crimes of the Holocaust, and providing hundreds of thousands of both Vichy and French SS troops for the German war effort. This one of the reasons I put this picture here is these are not Germans; these are French soldiers in German uniform with a little French. This is the SS Charlemagne division, which did horrific things on behalf of the Nazi occupiers. So, again, the myth of pure French victims, as is often portrayed by this crying person when France fell in May 1940, doesn't doesn't capture the extent of French collaboration as well. So initially, though, and I want to complicate France's involvement as well. So initially, many French people, especially those in the colonies, opted for Charles de Gaulle's Free French forces. They wanted to resist. They had no desire to become Nazis themselves. Many more inside the home country also joined the resistance. A disproportionately high percentage of the resistance, though, was made up of foreigners inside of France and communists. Just weeks after the French surrender, however, and this is, I want to go over this brief story to explain why so many French people supported the Nazis. So, weeks after uh, the surrender, Churchill ordered a secret Royal Air Force bombing mission on the French naval fleet that was docked at Oran, Algeria. The fleet was actually planning to sail to Saint-Michel and join the heart of the Free French resistance there. But Churchill worried that the French fleet might join with Vichy, which would give the Germans powerful naval forces. The German navy was very very minimal during World War II. So to avoid that eventuality, the RAF conducted a sneak attack, killing perhaps 3,000 French sailors and destroying their ships. The Germans and Nazi sympathizers inside France used this as propaganda to gain significant support for the Axis among ordinary French people. It was very much like Pearl Harbor, where a similar number of people were killed in a surprise, unprovoked attack that ended up galvanizing the American war effort. I just want to compare these two propaganda posters from the period. Remember Pearl Harbor, work, fight, sacrifice. And here you see a French sailor holding up a French flag saying, "N'oubliez pas Oran," don't forget Oran. And this is a picture of the Oran attack, a surprise attack by the British. That was almost identical to Pearl Harbor. It happened earlier than Pearl Harbor. So, and again, the reason the British did it is they were worried that the Germans would get their hands on the ships. So, after conquering France, Hitler hoped to knock out the Royal Air Force and either neutralize or invade Great Britain. He vastly underestimated the strength of what was still the premier world power. During the Air War, the battle of also called the Battle of Britain, British and American manufacturing more than supplied the RAF with its needs to resist. RAF personnel came from all over the empire, as well as volunteers from recently conquered countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia. Later, when Yugoslavia fell, even the king of Yugoslavia would fly for the RAF. The success of these crews on the ground and in the air meant that a serious world power was fully resolved to fight against Hitler, though Hitler vainly hoped that the British might somehow join with him because of his goofy racial theories. So, in 1941, Germans, along with Italian, Hungarian, and Bulgarian allies, invaded Yugoslavia. They were quickly joined by the collaborationist Croatian Ustasha regime as well. Hitler wanted to relieve Italian troops bogged down in Greece and shore up the Balkans. Oh, whoops, I don't have the right picture here on my slide, so I'm talking about the invasion of Yugoslavia. Um, his entire extremist ideology was inspired by um, okay, so Hitler invaded Yugoslavia because he wanted to relieve Italian troops bogged down in Greece and shore up the Balkans before the big invasion of the USSR. So, yes, on the right slide. Hitler had been planning to invade the USSR for years. His entire extremist ideology was inspired by the American annexation of the West, where he felt a superior race had taken living room or Lebensraum from an inferior people. He wanted to do that in Eastern Europe too, where he felt Slavs were an inferior race who would ultimately be both starved and subdued into a servant class for Germans. These experiments had already reached horrifying levels in Poland, which the Germans had been occupying for almost 2 years. On July 22nd, 1941, Hitler's forces invaded the Soviets. Ultimately, most right wing parties in Europe contributed troops to the Eastern Front. In addition to Germans, millions of Romanians, Hungarians, Slovaks, Croatians, Serbs, Slovenes, Ukrainians, Italians, French, Danes, Dutch, Norwegians, Baltic peoples, and more fought on the Eastern Front. I really want to emphasize this that, Hitler was joined by right wing parties from across Europe in all of his conflicts. So the Germans at first advanced quickly, eventually all the way to the Volga, where they were stopped the next year at the city of Stalingrad, and almost to Moscow, where they were stopped by fierce resistance helped by a cold winter, and to Leningrad, where they were stopped by an unbelievably heroic, almost 3 year long resistance. The Germans practiced terrifying occupation policies at first, but eventually realized they could win many anti Soviet groups of people over to their cause, though there was always tension with their belief in the racial inferiority of the people whose help they otherwise desperately wanted. So, Pearl Harbor, the American Oran. After Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Declared war on all of the Axis powers. So, the U.S. strategy was first to focus on protecting its assets in the Pacific, then winning the war in Europe before turning its full attention to the Japanese. So, um, protect things in the Pacific, put full efforts towards Europe, and then later turn towards the Japanese. But to fight the war in Europe, Roosevelt largely followed Churchill's lead. Stalin felt like the US and Britain postponed opening a second front in Europe because they wanted to protect British colonial interests. Indeed, the first battles for American land forces were in North Africa, somewhere that had minimal fascist troops, but an area that was important for British colonial interests. So then in 1943, the US, Free French, and British invaded Sicily, then Italy, to secure more air bases to bomb Germany. Again, fighting in Italy was something that Stalin thought was a complete waste of time. Um, he figured why not just put in land forces? Stalin wanted the D-Day invasions to happen in 1942. Uh, so early in 1942, the U.S. devoted the majority of its military budget to the Army Air Corps, hoping to help the war effort by fighting hundreds of miles behind enemy lines, destroying enemy industrial capacity. Stalin again thought this was overall useless, and the verdict on this is still very much debated. There was a massive strategic bombing report that was produced by the Army Air Forces in 1945 whose purpose seemed more to justify air power and justify the eventual establishment of a separate branch of the military called the Air Force. Stalin, he believed that airplanes, or not Stalin. Stalin was kind of an idiot, but Marshal Zhukov believed that airplanes should be nothing but mobile artillery, and that they should only be used to hit targets that regular artillery couldn't hit in support of fast-moving ground troops. And yet, powerful interests in the U.S. tried to prove that air power was critical to the victory. Others argue that it just killed millions of civilians and hardened the German desire to resist. What seems clear is that every time a factory was bombed, it inspired people to rebuild the factory and keep production going. So a viable second front beyond the Soviet front wasn't opened until D-Day on June 6, 1944, when French, British, Canadian, and American soldiers stormed the beaches at Normandy. So some key battles in the defeat of the Germans, we'll deal with the Japanese a little bit later in this class, not today. Um, so some key battles include the air war, which that the air campaign was ongoing from 1942 to 1945, and by 1944, the U.S. and British had absolute air superiority over the Germans. Stalingrad, where Germans were pushed away from the Caucasus and their hope for Russian oil. The tank battle at Kursk, the brutal movement up the Italian peninsula, notably the battle at Monte Cassino, D-Day, then just the overall swift movement of Soviet forces across Eastern Europe. Um, you had the setbacks at the Battle of the Bulge, then the joint move on Germany, as well as the separate liberation of Yugoslavia and Greece, largely by their own partisan forces, who also turned on each other in both places at the end of the war, leading to a lengthy civil war in Greece. And you had partisan and resistance movements that were critical across occupied areas of the continent. So, the Holocaust has been remembered in the West as one of the primary reasons for why our countries fought. It certainly wasn't at the time and factored very little into the war calculus of military commanders. In the 1930s, German policies were perhaps the most anti Semitic of any country in Europe, though many countries had their own horribly anti Semitic policies as well. By the 1930s, though, Jews had been fully removed from public life, stripped of citizenship, and ghettoized from mainstream German society. Official anti Semitism was rampant across Europe, especially in countries with large Jewish populations like Poland, Romania, Hungary, Lithuania, and France. The actual mass murder of Jewish people, however, seems to have occurred without official orders from above, but based on the zealousness of soldiers on the ground after the invasion of the Soviet Union. They had been given the Commissar's order to kill Soviet political leaders. Based on the propaganda they had imbibed over the previous decade, they interpreted that to be Jewish people, first men, but within only a week, women and children too. So within a week of July 22nd, 1941, mass murder of Jewish people was happening in the Soviet Union. And the regular army started these killings, the Wehrmacht. But within the first week, Einsatzgruppen, which were originally special special forces, originally formed, and not special forces in the sense that we use the term, mostly old men unfit for military service. They had originally been formed to terrorize Poles. They had murdered thousands of Polish intellectuals after the 1939 invasion. The Soviets did the same thing, murdering, among others, roughly 27,000 Polish military officers at Katyn in Poland. But the Einsatzgruppen began killing Jewish civilians within a week of the invasion in 1941. Romanians, of their own accord, began doing the same near Odessa, as well as to their own domestic Jewish populations in Moldova and Romania proper. Roughly one-tenth of all Holocaust victims were killed by Romanian soldiers. That summer, the Reichsfuhrer, or Secretary of State Heinrich Himmler, visited some of these killers and cried, not for their murdered victims, but for the psychological effect of these murders on the murderers. So that fall at Helmno and Belzec, both in Poland, camps were built for where a few people could murder those from the Jewish ghettos in Poland, where most Polish Jews had already been forced into by the Nazis over the previous 2 years. After the United States joined the war, Hitler blamed Jewish people and seems to have organized a conference at Wannsee in Germany that was held in January of 1942, where every sector of the German economy was represented, and Germans coordinated how to kill the Jews of Europe on a shoestring budget, and they coordinated how to profit off of both Jewish assets and even the actual physical remains of Jewish bodies. So the camps at Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Majdanek were built in 1942 and sped up after Czech partisans killed Reinhard Heydrich, who had chaired the Wannsee Conference. There were hundreds of concentration and labor camps all over Europe. Most people who went to concentration camps survived. The 6 camps that I just named, though, were death camps, primarily devoted to murder, though much industry went on in the Auschwitz complexes too. Most people who went to death camps were Jewish and did not survive. So by 1945, the Nazis and their many European collaborators managed to murder 6 million Jewish people, roughly 300,000 Roma and Sinta people, sometimes called gypsies, in the Podramos, and 3 million Soviet POWs. These 3 groups were targeted for murder. Many other ethnic, religious, political, and sexual minorities were sent to concentration camps, and many perished in them. And by sexual minorities, I mean gay people. That's the terminology of the time, which is, offensive and messed up. But many perished in them. But it was Jewish people and the Roma Sinta who were targeted with genocide. Soviet POWs who didn't agree to collaborate were also ultimately targeted with murder. The Germans were, however, rather decent to POWs from Western countries. They at least followed the Geneva Conventions, mostly with them. So this next picture shows the initial invasion of Poland, and I want you to look closely at it. Notice the many horses. Uh, German power, especially their supposed invincibility, has been overhyped for many of the last 80 years. Yet their power was nothing compared to that of the United States of America, where horses were only used by the military in extreme terrain situations, as they still are used today. The U.S. military uses horses today in, Afghanistan, special forces do. The reality, as you look at this picture and see horses, and minimal supplies, is that the Germans were not prepared for the war Hitler led them into. Many of his generals realized this and even tried to resist, but to no avail. The only reason that the Germans lasted for so long was that Hitler's ideologies were shared across the continent, and into the Middle East and even India. Not by everyone, of course, but by enough that millions and millions of non Germans fought for and with Hitler. In 1950, 1945, this was rather convenient to forget. Um, so I want to talk about collaborators now. So, over the past 70 years, West Germans, to a lesser extent East Germans, have slowly come to engage with their crimes. The term Vergangenheitsbewältigung is one we're going to come back to in this class, but it refers to coming to terms with the past, basically trying to make right past wrongs through things like paying reparations and sincere apologies and trying to learn from past mistakes to make sure such things never happen again. Germans have done a fairly good job at this, with many exceptions. Other places that actively collaborated with the Germans in carrying out not only their military policies, but the Holocaust itself, have, to many extents, done a poorer job. I have pictures here of Ukrainians, this is 2014, celebrating Stepan Bandera, a leader of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, whose forces murdered thousands of Poles and Jews, and even volunteered for the Ukrainian SS regiment that was largely responsible for staffing the death camps. To many today, in Western Ukraine in particular, Bandera is a hero of anti Soviet resistance, which he also did. But there's not much critical engagement with his crimes among many on the right in Ukraine today. And then below that, I have a picture of Croatians in the mid 1990s when their conflict with Serbia was ongoing, holding an Ustasha flag, the organization that killed virtually all of Yugoslavia's Jews and as many as 700,000 Serbs during World War II in their own death camp in Croatia at Jasenovac. The Croatian far right still celebrates the Ustasha as resistors to Serbs and communism. They had mainstream appeal in the presidency of Franjo Tudjman in the 1990s when Croatians were committing war crimes or supporting the commission of war crimes in Bosnia. So there has not been serious pressure on groups like these to deal with the crimes of the war. In Poland, a law was passed 2 years ago making it a crime to blame Poland for Nazi crimes. The law mentions that the term Polish concentration camps is inaccurate as they were run by Germans. Uh, sure, it's true. Many people have worried that this law can be used to forbid mentions of Poles who aided the Nazis or the rampant anti Semitism of the Polish Home Army, the Armia Krajowa, or the post war pogroms against Jewish survivors, where mobs killed hundreds of people. There's been a European wide tendency to forget any crimes that weren't committed by Nazis. In 1987, a French writer, Henri Rousseau, called this the Vichy syndrome, after the unwillingness of people to talk about the collaborators in his own country, where people carried out things like the Ville de Huive massacre, where French people essentially were responsible for rounding up and sending their own French Jewish population to Auschwitz. So here's just a couple other. I've got some recruitment posters on the left. This creepy one says, "You too are responsible for the destiny of the Slovene people." It's a collaborationist recruitment poster. It's like creepy Uncle Sam. Roughly 15,000 collaborators fought with the Germans in Slovenia. In the middle, you've got an Ustasha poster. It says, "Never a slave, rob nikada." And, hundreds of thousands of Ustasha fought with the Nazis. And then on the right, you've got a French um, poster. It says, Pourquoi pour l'Angleterre? So, why for England? Why are French people dying? They're dying on behalf of England. So all of these are non-German forces who fought for the Nazis. So I want to shift gears and be a little more positive now. When covering the Shoah or the Holocaust, it's important to remember that the Nazis and their allies wanted to murder the entire Jewish population of Europe. There were roughly 10 million Jews within their grasp. 4 million survived. because of thousands of heroic people, many of whom are recognized as righteous among nations by Yad Vashem in Israel. The video that I've got for you to watch this week is about one of them. And this video really hits at the notion of the U.S. as the uncomplicated good guys when it comes to the Holocaust. Of the 4 million saved, um, so jumping away from him now, of the 4 million saved, perhaps 2 million of the Jewish people who were saved by ordinary Soviets, whose names are mostly forgotten. They were railway workers who, in the early months of the invasion, let Jewish people get on trains going east. They didn't have orders to do this. In fact, their orders were for civilians not to be allowed on trains going east. Trains were for priority military transportation only, but they knew that Jews were being killed, so Jewish people were often allowed on as a silent, unspoken pact of ordinary goodness in extraordinary times. Many of the people pictured here were diplomats. You've got Wallenberg, Sugihara, Sardari, and De Sousa Mendes. They used a similar ruse to help people. They basically gave visas to Jewish people to allow them to escape. Sugihara and Sardari were Japanese and Iranian, respectively. They were in Berlin and both saved hundreds of people. Sugihara got people evacuated to Japanese occupied Shanghai, which was not a good place to be during the war, but a place where they mostly survived. Wallenberg was a Swede who got out roughly 90,000 visas to people in Hungary, and about 10% of visa receivers survived. He died in Soviet prison shortly after the war was over. De Sousa Mendes was a Portuguese diplomat who gave out 30,000 visas in occupied Paris, was eventually sent home and fired for what he did. Not Paris, sorry, in Bordeaux. He died penniless a few years after the war, leaving a wife and 16 children behind. Survivors later found his family and helped support them. Irena Sendler was a social worker who rescued hundreds of children from the Warsaw Ghetto. Most of the righteous among nations are Polish, as most of Europe's Jews were in Poland, which shows the basic humanity and decency of ordinary people. Oskar Schindler was a German industrialist who saved people by employing them in his factories. Many of these people on this list have had movies made about them too. Finally, I want to just tell the tragic, interconnected story of the heroism of Joel Brand and Rudolf Kaschner, among others. Brand was a Hungarian American who had grown up in Austria and Hungary. He had immigrated to the U.S. and become an agent for the Office of Strategic Services, which is a forerunner to the CIA. During the war, he took it upon himself to do something about the murder of Hungary's Jews. Hungary had been an ally of Hitler since the beginning, but their leader, Miklos Horthy, despite his own anti Semitism, refused to murder the Jews of Hungary. The same was true of other Hitler allies like King Boris of Bulgaria or, and Mussolini in Italy. Bulgarian and Hungarian forces did round up Jews for murder outside their home countries, however. So in March of 1944, though, German forces occupied Hungary to help defend against the Soviets. They decided that the 800,000 Jews of Hungary would be deported to Auschwitz. By this time, everyone knew what the Nazis were about, and they knew that the Soviets would be in Hungary within months. Auschwitz by then had the capacity to murder about 4,000 people per day. Therefore, anything to stall the Nazis could save lives. A plan was proposed to the American Army Air Force to bomb Auschwitz, to basically take it offline for even a day or two, with the hope that this could save thousands. Commanders of the Army Air Forces refused, preferring to devote resources to more important objectives like terrorizing German civilians. So the previously mentioned Wallenberg slowed down deportations, often having his men board trains, hand out Swedish visas, then demand that the Hungarians or Nazis in charge let them loose. Sometimes this worked. So while this was ongoing, Joel Brand set a secret message to Heinrich Himmler and set up a meeting with him, playing off his anti-Semitism, basically saying, "Hey, we know the Jews got us into this war." Brand was Jewish himself, and we know we'll have to fight the Soviets when the war is over. And we know that the Jews control Washington, so let's make a deal. So Brand got Himmler to believe that Roosevelt would give him 10,000 trucks only to be used against the Soviets in exchange for 100,000 Hungarian Jews. It was bogus, absolutely untrue, but Himmler believed it. So, in a sign of good faith, Himmler allowed one trainload of 1,000 people to be sent to Switzerland. Rudolf Koschner was the one who organized the train. Once the people were safely in Switzerland, Himmler realized he had been duped, and that was done. Brand went to his grave feeling like a failure that he hadn't been able to do something more to save the Jews of Hungary. Ultimately, 400,000 of them were murdered. His heroics, along with those of many others, ensured that it wasn't 800,000. Rudolf Koschner was put on trial in Israel in 1957 for having favored his own family members and profited from allowing people on the train. There's no evidence that he did either, but in the court of public opinion, he was condemned. And before the trial concluded, an Israeli murdered him in the street. So I simply want to point out that so many heroes who resisted the Holocaust received little to no recognition. They, like Hiram Bingham, did what was right just because it was right. So after the war, it was the victorious Allies who won the right to determine how best to try the egregious crimes of Nazi fascism. The Soviets, Americans, British, and French wanted to avoid the appearance of victor's justice and used the trials at Nuremberg to reframe notions of human rights, a term which was in widespread use since the Atlantic Charter of 1941, but had older usage too. Frederick Douglass would occasionally refer to it in his argument for rights for slaves. So, out of Nuremberg, the crimes of waging aggressive war were recognized, i.e., you can't start a war just to conquer your neighbor. Genocide was defined and made internationally illegal, even if again against one's own population. And human rights, codified in the 1948 United Nations Declaration, became a new global standard for behavior. The omissions and hypocrisy of not trying the Allies for war crimes, too, has long been commented on. But at minimum, the hopeful legacies of Nuremberg are something many in the world are still striving for today. Our world in 2020 is far more peaceful than the world of 1939. So in this picture, you see Chief U.S. Prosecutor Robert Jackson on the right and Orrin Heaton, a 17-year-old MP, on the left. And Orrin happens to be my uncle, my mom's oldest brother, who arrived with his unit in Germany on May 15th, 1945, 1 week after the war ended. He was sad to have missed it, but he was an MP for the duration of the Nuremberg trials. So you see Goofy Orrin right here in many of the courtroom pictures of what's going on in Nuremberg. So I've listed the European-wide nature of crimes against humanity already, but have not yet looked at the crimes of the victorious Allies too. There were the bombings, American executions of Japanese POWs, the atomic bombings, terror bombings by the British, the Soviet policy of using mass rape as a weapon of war, executions of suspected collaborators at the end of the war, and forced deportations of German civilians from across Eastern Europe, just to name the main categories of crimes by Allied countries. People in neutral countries as well often profiteered by supplying the Axis powers in violation of established neutrality law at the time. So, yet, despite these crimes, the defeat of Nazi fascism has been used as a jumping off point to imagine and structure a more just world. And I'm curious to hear what you all think about our progress or our lack thereof. So, all right, I've got your bonus questions down below. These are in the PowerPoint that's posted online as well, but I'll just pause for a few seconds on each of these to make it easier for you to hit pause on YouTube. All right. And I hope you all have a lovely, enjoyable rest of your week.